everyone, and welcome to AFI Fest 2020, presented by Audi. My name is Malin Khan, and I'm a programmer with the festival. Before we begin today's discussion, I would like to thank all of our supporters, our presenting sponsor, Audi, our AFI members, as well as you, our audience. Thank you so much for joining us with this very special virtual edition of AFI Fest. You should have all just seen the film Sisters with Transistors, which was set to premiere at the South by Southwest Film Festival earlier this year, before the festival was unfortunately canceled. However, we are extremely pleased to be sharing it with you now, and here with me today is director Lisa Rovner. Lisa, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you.
I really love this film so much. It's a film that I think opens up so many different worlds. It changes the way that you think and hear about sounds, and maybe most wonderfully, it introduces you to these incredible musicians and their own kind of fascinating perspectives about sound and music. So I just kind of want to start with electronic music, how you first became aware of it and what struck you about it.
So I can't actually remember a time when I wasn't aware of electronic music. Electronic music penetrates pretty much every single aspect of my life since I was a kid, whether that's, you know, from stuff that's on television or the video games that I play with my brother, or, you know, it was just everywhere basically. But I think I recognized its transcendent qualities probably most vividly at a rave. I think that that's when I kind of realized, whoa, this stuff is really just so interesting and really takes you on a trip.
And how did that turn into a film for you?
You know, it was just one of those things, it's just a subject that just kind of fell into my lap. I just kind of discovered it quite randomly, and just, it kind of ticked all the boxes of what I'm interested in, which is music and art and, you know, philosophy and politics, feminism. So it was just, once I discovered all the archive, that there was all this archive, once I saw their photographs, I was just compelled to break the silence that kind of surrounds their story.
And then how did you select the particular women that you've chosen to profile in this documentary?
So I guess I should say that, you know, first I want to say that this is not the complete history of women in electronic music. This is there is no such thing. And that basically the archive is really what drove me to choose the women who feature in the film, the archive I could find. There are other women out there that I know of and other women that I don't know of, but basically it all was dependent on the archive. So the archive really drove the story.
Yeah, that's a really kind of interesting kind of thread to go down, because for me, you know, coming from a film perspective, I really see the kind of tracing the technological innovation, which I think for film and potentially for music as well, I'm not sure if you kind of experienced that, it happens kind of simultaneously in different parts of the world. So how did you kind of, like, what were the challenges for you of tracing that innovation?
I think that the innovation was pretty straightforward. I think the real challenge was trying to tell so many stories in one film. You know, not only are there different women, but there's different technology, there are different countries. So it was really more just kind of how do we tie all of these stories together? And I don't know if it's something that I necessarily want to do again right away, because it was really challenging.
Yeah, I'm sure. And, you know, I mean, one of the things that's really wonderful as well throughout your film is you have this kind of, you have Laurie Anderson, who I think is maybe better known than a lot of the women in the film, but, you know, she's narrating it. She's not a subject, you know, and you have her kind of, her soothing voice throughout the film, kind of just guiding us. How did she become involved in this project?
So I reached out to her just very simply via email, and she was immediately kind of enthusiastic about the project, the film. And I didn't really know, I knew that I wanted her to be part of the film, but I also didn't feel that she was quite as unsung as the others. And I guess it became pretty clear pretty quickly that I just was dreaming of having her narrate the film. And what I love about her is just that she has this really disarming way of talking about really serious stuff. She uses like comedy, poetry, like everything that I wanted the narration to do. And it was just done very quickly. It was a very short text, and she just recorded it herself and sent it over. And I just wanted her, so there was no need for many takes, and there was no need to set up a whole, you know, it was just, I just wanted her. So yeah, it was a great, it was just great.
Yeah, it's so wonderful to, you know, hear her again. And you know, that you mentioned before that they all kind of come from these different perspectives, the women that you've chosen to feature. And it also seems to kind of transform with time, because there's like a little bit of a chronology to the timeline that you've depicted. And you can kind of see that it moves through kind of this academic, technological approach, moving into fine arts, outsider arts, activism, healing, and then kind of also pop culture being this other element. Is this just how you kind of opted to tell the story, or do you think that it tells something broader about the relationship between art and technology?
Well, I think, I don't know that it's something that was very much of a conscious choice. The story is relatively chronological, and of course, like, you know, early electronic equipment, the machines that people were using to make electronic music were, generally speaking, either in radio stations or academic institutions. So that's why there's a lot of the early stuff is tied to those kind of institutions. I think that everybody is all the women are they're all pioneers of electronic music, but they're all so unique in their approach, and of course their interests and how they relate sound and to their environment. So I think there's no conscious choice there in that development.
Another thing that's really incredible is the way that you've edited together this archival footage. It's almost like a composition in itself. And it seems like you've sourced, you know, archival footage from everywhere, not just electronic music. It's really kind of builds this story in a really organic way. How did you approach that research process in the archives?
So yeah, so the archive was just such a huge process. It was actually really different. Like, some of the women had their own archives, some universities housed, you know, little bits of archive, but it was actually quite a difficult thing to uncover. It took many years, and originally we had thought we'd get I naively thought, oh, I'll just get an archivist to do it. But when you're paying an archivist on a day rate and the material isn't easily accessible, it's just impossible. So I kind of took it into my own hands, and I realized, like, as I was doing the research and doing interviews, I was discovering where to find the archive. But there are a lot of holes in that story. You know, these women weren't filmed like, you know, some of the other archive films where people were filmed throughout their whole lives doing everything. You know, there's just a little bit of archive. And so a lot of the editing was kind of figuring out how we would illustrate what they're talking about. And so it was really a playful process in the edit. And the music itself is so abstract that it really lends itself to these kind of, you know, more, yeah, like a more abstract way of telling their stories through the archive.
Is that something that comes about kind of organically as you were kind of collecting all of this footage, or how did you work with your editing team to put it all together?
Yeah, so I worked with 3 different editors, which is not typical, but because of the way that because of the funding, basically, we were just getting a little bit of funding here and then editing when we could, and, you know, editors' schedules, geography, it makes it that we couldn't work with the same person throughout. But I think the editors that I did choose to work with, I think that they all have, I guess we all kind of see eye to eye on, like, or how to illustrate visually the story. We all kind of agree that it should be artistic and abstracted.
There are segments that struck me in particular, which look almost like experimental film or specifically visual music. How did you select those, and did you encounter many links between the movements in experimentation and image, with sound and image?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the women were doing soundtracks to experimental films, like Barron was doing the soundtrack to Shirley Clarke's films. But yeah, I think that the music is so experimental. It was really important that the visuals kind of reflected that world, that it didn't feel like 2 completely different worlds. And yeah, just the nature of the sounds, it was just so much scope to do kind of experimental things with the visuals.
You conclude this film with a dedication to the artists that you feature, who have now passed, and they've clearly left a profound legacy in electronic music. I'm wondering where you see electronic music now, and particularly women in it, existing in the culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because obviously while I was making the film, I was trying to reach out to women or a lot of the younger contributors are kind of in a way doing quite radical things with sound and exploring the medium in a similar shape. So I think that there are loads of very interesting women working in electronic music now, and I hope that there will be even more after this film comes out, because I think there's so much to learn from these women in terms of just pushing boundaries, not only sonically, but also politically, emotionally, creatively, just following your dream, doing your thing, and eventually time will catch up and people will understand just how radical what you're doing is. And I think it's a great message for everybody in every discipline.
I want to go back to kind of the women themselves and how you worked with them. There's this striking footage at the end with Eliane Radigue. Did you film that yourself?
Yeah, so there are 3 of the women who are still amongst us, and I wanted to do something. I didn't really want to do a traditional, I knew I wanted to do an all archive documentary, but I wanted to find a way of bringing it to the present, and that was my way. So yeah, so I filmed Laurie Spiegel. Laurie Spiegel every day. What we filmed her doing is something that she does every day. She feeds the birds in downtown Manhattan where she lives, and I just thought it was a very symbolic image of her kind of feeding younger. There's just this really beautiful symbolism in that action. Birds like women. This feeding birds, inspiring flight, I guess sustaining flight. Suzanne, when we went to interview her, we filmed her just kind of jamming on her boucle, which is kind of what she's been doing a lot of recently. So it was really nice to kind of catch these women in their present. And then Eliane, I knew that she was doing so we're in her flat in that scene, and I knew that she was preparing a composition. So she's now working with real musicians, and it's just so amazing to kind of witness the process. So because of her old age, the musicians come to her place to do the rehearsals. It was an incredible thing to film. It was incredibly moving to see her kind of react to how these musicians interpreted the way that she transmits her compositions. It was honestly one of the most, it was life-changing, that moment.
Yeah.
It was super emotional. Like every time I see it, I well up, it's, there's just so much joy, but also so much sadness in the fact that it took her this long to actually have musicians, play her music.
Yeah.
Compositions seriously. So yeah, it was really a beautiful, and then the cinematographer that I worked with on that particular, I just think she's just did such an incredible job. She's just so musical, the way that she shot it, and it was just one take, it was just 20 minutes of Eliane's compositions in her flat, as the sun was coming down. I mean, it's just magical, basically.
It's really an affecting scene. I was hoping we could maybe round up the conversation just by talking about your upcoming projects, what you might be working on now.
Yeah, so I'm hoping to transition from documentary to drama, and I'm currently writing a script. So I'm in the very early phases of that process, of the creative process, which is kind of my favorite because everything is possible. And I'm just kind of building images and sentences and just kind of building a script, but in a very loose way. I've never written a kind of traditional script, and I don't really want to. I'm very inspired by different ways of storytelling, but basically it's the story. It takes place in 1968 in France. It's kind of inspired by my mom, and it's a story of how 68, or the story of 68 seen from the countryside, rural France, and from a personal point of view. So how it affected a family.
Wow.
Because we think of 68 and we think of, students in the streets, and, we think of the Situationists, we think of the slogans, but we don't actually realize, and we think of it as a failed revolution in many ways, but it completely changes certain individuals. So I'm kind of interested in exploring that.
Wow, quite a transition. That sounds wonderful. I can't wait to see it.
Yeah, transition, but still, I want to use real archive. I've been looking at how to show the countryside in 68, and so I'd like to maybe film it the way the archive was filmed. And it's still politics. It's still the story of a woman looking for freedom. So it is a transition, but it's still connected to the themes that I'm interested in exploring.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for making this film, for including it in AFI Fest. We're so pleased to be presenting it. It's such a wonderful film.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And thank you to everybody that worked on the film. I have to say, this is it's so important to recognize that filmmaking is such a team sport, and it's I couldn't have done it without so many people. So I just thank you to everybody that helped me make this film.